Hello, my name is Aaron Sharinian, and today I represent the United Nations Foundation. But I represent part of this community, and as this community knows, there is an issue that could be considered the issue of the day. It is an issue that for many of you, many of us, has been a big part of recent, perhaps, of our news feeds, and for some people has been an issue of consciousness. But this issue of the day is the issue of every day for millions of people around the world. It cannot afford to just be the issue of a day, as it is a reality of every single day for so many. We're going to have a conversation right now about refugees, the route to resettlement. And the people who will be joining us for this conversation are people for whom this is an issue of passion. It's been an issue of commitment. It is one of urgency. Please help me in welcoming for this moment, representing the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the High Commissioner himself, Antonio Guterres, and Duany, actor, UNHCR Goodwill Ambassador. Helping lead this conversation, we're privileged to have with us 60 Minutes, Lara Logan.
All right.
So good afternoon, everybody. So this is kind of, this will be the most interesting panel of the day. This is the issue of the moment, really. I don't think there's anyone in this room who couldn't have been moved by the sight of all the refugees pouring out of Syria and Iraq and all the other countries where people are quickly switching their IDs and trying to pretend they're Syrians so that they can beat the rush to Europe. And we are privileged, as you know, the 10th High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, and Duany, who is an immigrant and a refugee himself. 60 Minutes did a great three-part series on the lost boys. He fled South Sudan, the 5th child in his family, and I think for me one of the most moving things, it was 18 years before he could see his family again. Who can imagine what that's like as a child, to be separated from those you love for 18 years. And he's one of the lucky ones, right, because he got to the United States. Antonio's really the guy who's going to get all the flack if this crisis doesn't work out. So what are you doing about this at the moment? How is the world?
Well, I think that, if you allow me first a comment, I've been here several times in the last few years in this same place. You always have cared about refugees. But if you look a little bit down into the United Nations area, it was very difficult in past years to put refugees in the center of the agenda. But this year, you can't imagine. Everybody wants to discuss refugees. Everybody wants to have me on meetings to discuss refugees. And let me be very frank, the reason is very simple. For the first time, refugees came massively into the developed world. With refugees only going into the developing world, there was less interest. But for the first time, they came in big numbers to Europe. So then it became an issue everywhere.
And not big numbers to the United States, because we haven't done our part yet, right?
But there is a campaign to ask for 100,000 resettlement opportunities to the United States. And I think it will be very important for the civil society to put as much pressure as possible to allow for that to happen. But what we are seeing now in Europe, of course, has a lot of impact because Europe is a rich part of the world. But let's not forget that 86% of the refugees are in the developing world. And let's not forget that we are witnessing the staggering escalation of a dramatic problem in the world. I don't like to use numbers because what matters is people and people that suffer. But in 2010, there were 11,000 people displaced by conflict per day in the world. 2011, 14,000. 2012, 23,000. 2013, 32,000. Last year, 42,500. Which means that conflicts are spreading everywhere. Old conflicts are not being solved, and the number of people forced to flee, losing their houses, sometimes members of their family, their communities, is escalating in a staggering way. And what is terrible, the international community is largely failing them. Humanitarian aid has decreased in 2015. Countries that are hosting them are under tremendous pressure without enough support, and resettlement opportunities into the developed world are still very limited. It's time to show true solidarity with the people that is suffering so much, and to be able to overcome resistances, forms of egoism, xenophobia, and many other demonstrations of how, unfortunately, especially the richest part of the world has not been able to show enough solidarity with the refugee population in the world.
So for a personal story, you know, refugees and numbers, none of those things mean very much until you meet someone who is a refugee. And Ger has managed to come to the United States, to work successfully, to become an international model, to star in several movies. The Fighter with Mark Wahlberg, I interviewed him on the set of that story when he was making that movie. It was a great film. But perhaps the most important things for you is the journey that you've managed to make and go home even to Sudan and vote in the first elections. Can you tell us a little bit about what it has meant to you to have a second chance?
Well, first of all, you know, it is an honor to be here speaking to everybody, and I couldn't find any better person to really recover all of those issues that been dragging our humanity into a different direction that we don't support. As a Goodwill Ambassador to UNHCR, yes, it's an honor. And also, as a former political refugee, I think I'm given an opportunity where I have to reconstruct myself as a person, and coming to this country when I was only 15, 16 years old, it was an opportunity that was given to me by somebody somewhere. So when I'm sitting in a house and I'm really watching all the refugees are really going through this crisis that I have gone through, you know, it kind of breaks my heart, you know, and that's what makes it so important for my work as a Goodwill Ambassador. I'm the new guys around the block, so it makes my work really important for me to speak about what I know, because I went through that path. I know how it is like to really leave your country and also to lose everything that you ever know, your way of life. So to be here and build myself all over again, I couldn't just duck my head down and stand to this issue. I think refugees are part of humanity, and we can't leave them behind.
So what we discussed backstage, which is what everyone always wants to know, what's going on behind what we all say in public, is that the international community is failing miserably in this crisis, that not enough is being done. And so I want to know from you, Antonio, what are your top 3 things that you would like to see happening in order to do better?
First, we need much more massive humanitarian aid to the refugees themselves. It was absolutely dramatic in 2015, this year, when humanitarian agencies in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey had to cut assistance for lack of funding. Can you imagine what it represents for a refugee that came from Syria, that lost hope about a political solution in Syria, that is living in very difficult circumstances in Lebanon or Jordan, and then the World Food Programme, because of lack of funding, cutting 40% of the food support to refugee families in these countries. There was this feeling the world is abandoning us. And this is the reason why we had this spike of people moving into Europe. Now, massive humanitarian support is needed. Support to the host countries, Lebanon, Jordan. Can you imagine? Lebanon has now 1/3 of its population refugee. I mean, we are talking about Europe. In Europe, we are receiving 1 refugee per 1,000 persons in the European Union. In Lebanon, there is 1 refugee for each 3 Lebanese. Can you imagine the impact in the economy, in the society, how it's important to have massive structural economic support to countries like Lebanon or Jordan? And unfortunately, they have received very little support from the international community. And third, more opportunities to resettle refugees into the developed world. Refugees are not a burden. I mean, if you look at Gear, he gives a very important contribution to the American society today. If you look at Europe and all these Syrians coming, I mean, Europe has an aging population, fertility indexes of 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 in countries. To sustain the European society, you need migration, you need refugees. And these people that are coming, many of them have skills, have capacities, they are willing to work and to contribute. Refugees can be a very important solution for many of the problems of today's world if they are properly integrated in the societies where they want to contribute to a new future.
So Gary, you stayed... You fled South Sudan, you stayed in refugee camps in Ethiopia, you fled to Kenya, You were one of the few who managed to get from Kenya to the United States. And the promised land is not easy. People think it's the American dream, right? But what they leave out of the American dream is that people work hard in the American dream, and life here is not easy. So how difficult has it been for you to find your way?
Well, in the beginning, I was a teenager when I came here, and we came here in big numbers, but when we were brought here, and then all of a sudden our number really scattered everywhere, so we couldn't find ourselves. So in order to find a new way of life, and then you have to really pay attention to what's going on around this society, how to adapt to it. And that take opportunity from other people in order for you to really establish yourself. And having hopes that everything is not lost was always something that all the refugees really have. So when I'm watching a lot of refugees and they're talking about take me somewhere, or take my kids, and then I don't mind, I can go back to the problems as long as my kids is really can have an opportunity to go to school, because the school become the most important thing for all of us, especially
safety
and safety, education become the most important things. So of course, we all seeking the same thing. We wanted to live. At the end of the day, we're just human beings, and then we share one thing, and it's pain. And that's the reason we see in refugees, they flowing everywhere. So when a mother like that is speaking, and then she's not really losing the track of what it is, can bring her child to be educated and understand exactly what's going on in their country. Do you know what it takes for that person? Can you imagine?
Unbearable. I couldn't
yes.
even think about it. As a mother, I couldn't think of anything worse than having to give up my child so they could be safe.
And those people are in those categories. So I think this is the greatest time of their need, and then we should stand in as people.
So let's talk about the thing no one wants to talk about. The xenophobia, or the people who are threatened, the people who are scared. They see this massive, outpouring of refugees across their borders every day, small towns in Europe that really haven't changed much in many years, and they're scared. They're scared of being overwhelmed by all these people. There are people who don't have jobs in Europe. I mean, it's not easy to live in Europe. Life is expensive, and life is difficult. So how do you address that issue? How do you address people's concerns and fears?
Well, first of all, governments need to have adequate policies for the integration of refugees. And if you have those policies, if you invest in that integration, those fears can be diluted. But those fears are to a large extent the result of toxic propaganda by political leaders that want to have easy votes, playing with fear of people. As I said, in Europe we have now, arriving since the beginning of the year, 1 per 1,000 of the European citizens. If this was properly distributed, if this was properly managed, if the European Union and the states would have assumed their responsibilities, you wouldn't have these horrible scenes that you see on television of people running from one border to another, trying to find a way to get to Germany or to Sweden, because, nothing is prepared, nothing is organized to bring them in and to integrate them. Now, one thing that is very clear is, and I can tell you about the experience of my country. I'm from Portugal. Portugal has been with a very difficult economic crisis, as you know. High level of unemployment for what we were used. And we have migrants in Portugal. And when I go to visit my mother, that is 92 years old, and I go her whenever I can in weekends, not this one, we have always one person beyond the family, one person with her because she has some health problems to make sure that she's okay night and day. I've never seen a Portuguese taking care of her. There are no Europeans taking care of the European elderly people. They're all migrants, which means that Europe could not live without migrants or without refugees that come to Europe. And it's necessary to tell the truth to the people.
Or the US couldn't function without Mexican migrants.
This is the truth. This is the truth.
Yeah.
And I have to say that when political leaders in Europe say, for instance, okay, we are ready to receive refugees if they are Christian, but not if they are Muslims. I think this is the best thing that can be done to support the propaganda of the Islamic State or of other extremist groups. And so the capacity to show in the developed world, be it in Europe, in the United States or wherever, the capacity to show that we consider that diversity is richness is not the problem. That we understand our societies as being inevitably multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious, and that is good for our societies. I think we need to speak frankly to the people, to be able to alienate those fears and to be able to make people understand that there is a way to have an harmonious society based on diversity, and that this is a way for a continent like Europe or for a continent like the US to be able to prosper in the present world. There is no way you can live this idea of identities based on purely ethnic groups of the same nature, marrying among them, and I mean, this is no longer possible anywhere in the world.
So, so we only have a minute left. Gary, you were able to go back to South Sudan because what was then the longest running civil war in Africa was brought to an end. The Syrian conflict has been allowed not just to fester, but to get worse and worse and worse. So, I mean, sometimes you look at the TVs and you think, are there going to be any Syrians left in Syria? What is the responsibility that governments have to address these issues at their root cause? How do you feel about that?
Well, me as a Goodwill Ambassador to UNHCR, really important. But it's important for me not to, well, let's put the UNHCR alone. Even me as Duany and having my own sibling that are being displaced from my country, that make me go back in 2014 to look for them, you know, among many millions of people. So I was really overwhelmed by that. Of course, to see my country, which is the newest nation around the world, to plunge back into an intense civil war like that is something that none of us who really experienced the previous civil war was expecting, and that took so much out of me as a person. And now, what's going on in South Sudan, and then it's another thing. If we really have peace and for people to really make peace among themselves, it's completely is another work too that need the people of South Sudan. But I don't think we can really do it without the help of the people from outside our country, because it's a country that been helped in order for it to stand as it is. And I think South Sudanese people should open their mind and their heart to really welcome the help that everybody's trying to give them around the world. So in political issues, I'm very limited there because I'm not an expert, so I would like...
Well, our time is almost up. I just want to say we're focused on Syria right now. I just came back from Iraq, and people are pouring out of Iraq for the same reason, and there's no special pass for them. And as an African, I have to say, don't forget the Africans, because they've been struggling for years and nobody wants them, right? So thank you very, very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.